Hello guys, and welcome to some scary stories from the woods. The woods can be unpredictable. There are no streetlights, no quick exits, and often no cell service. When something feels wrong out there, you don't have many options. Let's get straight into it.
Good night, Tales.
I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night, we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family during the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a "what the hell," and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. But before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick, forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we weren't actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early in the morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you'd see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the open doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. Early in January of this year, I accompanied my grandfather down to eastern Tennessee to the small rural town he grew up in. After Hurricane Helene, my grandfather wanted to see how his childhood home, which is about a 20-minute drive east of the town, had fared during the devastating weather. While on this trip, however, my grandfather shared with me a lot of stories about his childhood growing up in Appalachia, and a lot of other things. I learned a lot about him that I had simply never known. One story in particular, however, was genuinely scary, and I had trouble sleeping the night after hearing it. I still occasionally have weird nightmares about it. I will recount that story below. In February of 1954, a few weeks before my grandfather turned 12, his family's little farm had been experiencing some attacks on their animals, mainly the chickens. In the weeks before, they had lost 7 or 8 chickens from their flock of 30 or so. They had a small property, an acre or two, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically near a place called Hall Mountain. One night, during a fairly heavy snowstorm, my grandfather's family was awoken to the sounds of chickens screaming and flocking around in their coops some 70 or so yards away from the house. My grandfather and his dad, Paul, immediately jumped into their boots and coats and ran outside to confront what they believed would be some coyotes. As they ran outside the back door, my great-grandfather with his rifle and my grandfather with a pellet gun both stopped dead in their tracks as they saw what my grandfather described the nastiest, most foul-looking human-type creature you could possibly imagine. A light on the barn illuminated the creature, and my grandfather said that it was almost bare naked, save for what looked to be a bear pelt draped around its shoulders, and had a dead chicken in its mouth. Paul snapped out of his shock and fired a few rounds at the creature. He nicked it once in the upper thigh as it ran across a field, initially on 2 legs, before dropping down to all 4s and disappearing into the woods. My grandfather and his father stood there in shock. They made sure the rest of the chickens and the other animals were all right before my grandfather was told to go back inside, check on his mom and sister, and go back to bed. Apparently, Paul stayed outside for a few hours, pacing back and forth on the porch, waiting for that creature to come back. My grandfather said he hardly slept the rest of that night, and when he got up the next morning, he saw his father in the living room on their phone. As he was eating breakfast, his father came into the dining room, whispered something to his wife, and sat at the table. When my grandfather finished eating breakfast, his mother left the room and his father cleared his throat and started talking. "I was on the phone with your uncle. He'll be here this afternoon with your cousin. We're going to follow the blood trail that was left behind by whatever creature we saw last night. It went down into the holler on the mountain." My grandfather said he just shook his head quietly and didn't really speak the rest of the morning. By 12:30, himself, his father, his Uncle Peter, and his cousin Samuel were all walking northwest into the woods following the bloody trail left behind the previous night. My grandfather said it felt like an hour or so must have passed before anyone spoke. His Uncle Peter, who was much more of a hunter than Paul, stopped everyone and pointed at something slightly up the trail. The tracks led up to a spot in the snow that was just soaked in blood. My grandfather said it looked like something had just keeled over it and died. What really shocked them as they approached it, however, was how it appeared like whatever had laid there had been dragged deeper into the woods. They began following the new trail that had been dragged through the snow, and began noticing multiple sets of tracks which were made by bare human feet, alongside the dragged trail. It was at this moment when my grandfather noticed his father switching the safety of his rifle to off. They trekked alongside the trail a little farther until they reached a small frozen stream. On the other side of the stream, tucked under a massive cliff overhang, was a cave entrance. My grandfather said it was about 20 feet across and maybe 6.5 feet tall at its tallest. The bloody drag marks and the multiple tracks led right across the stream and into the cave. Paul and Peter told the boys to wait behind a rock, and if they didn't shout back that they were okay in 5 minutes, to run back home and call the police. They walked over the river and stood at the cave entrance before shining a light into it and slowly walking in. My grandfather said that about 4 minutes passed before they heard his uncle's voice, but that it seemed like an eternity. They saw his Uncle Peter come out and his father shortly followed. My grandfather said that they were both pale as ghosts and that they hardly spoke on the long hike back. My grandfather and Samuel begged Paul and Peter to tell them what they saw, but the two men wouldn't budge, and they said that they would all talk later. They all returned to my grandfather's house around 3 that afternoon, and his Uncle Peter and Samuel immediately got in their truck and left without saying a word. My grandfather and his father walked in through the back door into the kitchen, where his grandmother was waiting anxiously. Paul hugged her and whispered something to her. She nodded and went into a separate room. Paul sat down at a desk in the kitchen and motioned for my grandfather to bring a chair over and sit. My grandfather did so, and this is what Paul told him, apparently verbatim. "Your uncle and I went into that cave and we saw people. They aren't people like you or me or anyone you know. They're very different. They live deep in the woods and don't leave hardly ever. They are almost like animals, I suppose. You might call them wild. It seems like they've lived deep in those woods and the hollers longer than anyone has ever been here. We saw the person I shot last night. He must have died. His people were giving him a burial, I believe. They saw us and they acknowledged us. They didn't seem mad, but I know we aren't welcome back there. Tommy, do not ever go across that creek. Everything over it is theirs, and we will leave them to it." My grandfather said that was the only time his father ever spoke of what he saw in that cave. His father never went back, and neither did he. I know the whole feral people concept is up in the air and most people don't believe it, which I completely understand. However, I don't think I do either. But the way my grandfather spoke about it, the sincerity with which he spoke, and the tone of his voice during certain parts of the story, I fully believe he was being honest. He truly saw his father fatally shoot a feral human, and his father and his uncle truly saw a small feral community living in a cave deep in the Appalachian Hills. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside of that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy, I hated it. All I had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive, obviously, took most of the day, so we got there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone else lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land we settled in, the cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour maybe. When we woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright colored red jacket. We slowly walked toward them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters, this is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. The weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and would look to be ski pants. Now, this is Texas, in the summer. It was about 98 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again, no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at that time, since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around to the front of the man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for any more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see him get worried. Almost immediately after I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was highly fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there we didn't know about, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone, no mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3. This story may be short, or it may be drawn out. I'm recounting these events as I type, as it was honestly one of the most horrifying things I have ever experienced, and it brings me genuine stress to think about. This happened maybe 2 to 3 years ago. I lived in southern West Virginia, and have for my entire life. The woods and mountains surround every direction you look, and nighttime is a darkness that you can never dream of unless experienced. I was with a friend, I'll call him Mark. Mark was at my house one evening, doing the usual things, watching UFC, playing Xbox, etc. It was extremely late when we finally got bored and decided to go for a walk on a nearby trail to smoke a joint. This is not a particularly long trail, but it is very dense in the woods that surround it, and it is easy to get freaked out when thinking of your surroundings. We finally get to about halfway into the trail, about 30 minutes in, where we stop, pack our joint, and stand on the trail to chill and talk. The forest is very alive tonight. There are always noises in the woods, but the amount of animal activity for the time, at this point it was probably past 1 a.m. This was strange and kind of eerie, but not alerting as any sort of predatory animal in the area may cause a disturbance. We finish smoking and continue our walk when almost immediately the forest falls dead quiet. And as soon as the forest goes quiet, there is a voice. It almost sounds like a mocking humanoid voice, shaky and uncertain, almost like an old children's toy, like the ones with the crackly speakers and robotic voice, if you know what I mean. This immediately sets us off. We bolt directly down the opposite length of the trail, but the sound does not gain distance. It doesn't get closer per se, but no matter how far we run down the trail, this eerie voice remains the same volume, going over and over with no quieting or stopping. At this point, I am convinced that we are in genuine danger, something I have felt very few times. Finally, after sprinting for who knows how long, we exit the trail, gasping for breath and almost at the verge of tears of how frightening this was. We begin to exit the trail, and about 5 minutes from the exit, there is a bone-shaking, heart-stopping, murderous scream from directly behind us. I know what a mountain lion sounds like. This was not an animal. This was not someone playing or watching a movie. This scream sent birds flying from nests and made my heart drop into my stomach. It was the most genuinely depraved and violent scream that I have ever heard. This is a true story that I've only told to maybe 3 people, all of whom seem to brush it off as false. I've never been a person to push for the existence of the paranormal or spiritual, but I genuinely believe I encountered something inhuman in those woods. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Teton area. My boyfriend at the time, now husband, let's call him H, was an avid outdoorsman and also served in the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so he decided to take me on my first backpack, just the 2 of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Tetons are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with bears up to this point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. First incident. My boyfriend looked like Indiana Jones. Machete hanging from his belt, large knives attached to each side of his pack, bear spray strapped to his wrist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 25-mile journey was all uphill. When in bear country, you're supposed to make noise so as not to startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on it. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying a 40-pound pack makes it difficult to make a conversation. We were an hour in and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing stream that was to our left of the trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. This usually indicates predators nearby. At this point, I was in front of my boyfriend, and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we had not said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time and gave each other knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill and immediately froze. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me, in the middle of the trail, was a grizzly bear. My husband wasn't aware yet, as he was behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and started flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get his attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting to all fours, not looking away from us. H quickly swung me around so that I was behind him, and he just started yelling. Being in the military, he knows how to yell. The grizzly wasn't quite fazed, as it started to walk slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. The bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, and he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. H said it's probably just some falling branches, but we both knew that wasn't the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment, H stopped moving in front of me. He turned around to look at me, and I turned to look behind me. To this day, we are not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large, black-brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzly that we had just seen a few moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was just off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that is exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. H was doing his best to console me. "Honey, this is extremely unusual. The bears usually stay away from humans. We're going to be okay. I'm sure that won't happen again." That was enough to convince me to continue on the backpack. Not another hour later, though, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we had sat down, I noticed bushes moving in a line toward the clearing toward us. Out of the brush comes this adolescent grizzly who looks just as spooked as I am sure we did, but he came straight for us. H, being the crazy nut that he is, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, "Bear spray at the ready." That did the trick, and the bear ran off. All I could think was, just my luck. But that wasn't even close to what happened the second night. Second night. Before we began our backpack, we had to let the ranger station know which trails route we planned to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the backpack to check on you to make sure everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we had been the sole hikers. We didn't see a single other person once we were en route. Anyway, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We had been following hoof prints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen any the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent valuable daylight trying to adjust my boots, laces, socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or 2 of daylight left, and in the woods, it got dark fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and H was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine wouldn't even turn on for some reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp, as we still needed to eat. It was freezing, and the wind was blowing. It was creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear H or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be around 200 meters in diameter, with the sides being 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though he didn't tell me how freaked he was till after we had left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from his headlamp, our small camp stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my pack. Half of the trees were dead, fallen just inside the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help alleviate my anxiousness, he started playing Ninja Sex Party out of his portable speaker. This didn't help much, as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. He also thought it would ward off any predators nearby. This is when we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our previous experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. Also, it was freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. Falling trees? There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. Thud. We both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing. Definitely not a falling tree. Thud. It came from right outside our tent. We both stopped breathing. H's hand found mine and we clung to each other, paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. Shouldn't be a person. We're the only ones on this side of the mountain." I was trying my hardest to stifle sobs, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inwards. At this point, whatever was outside knew we were inside. So I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed into the tent wall. I could make out the nose and an open mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. H said, "Nope," and pulled out a Glock from his sleeping bag. He cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading toward the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent till the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals we had left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud anyway. The takeaway? Wildlife is not the most dangerous thing in the backcountry. And that concludes these scary stories from the woods. Let me know in the comments if you would like to hear more of these types of stories, and be sure to subscribe to stay updated on the latest scary stories.